opposition teams can't seem to grasp the concept of principle, because we made it clear, even in opening government, the reason we want to make sure that these people are tried in countries of consumption is that the individuals who ended up consuming these drugs were their victims. And having them tried in the countries of where they were produced essentially leaves these individuals without justice. Because they couldn't rebut that very basic idea, both opposition teams started on the back foot and ended up arguing two basic premises. From opening, we received this idea that we wanted to put a veil of legitimacy which would allow these countries to one day maybe have democracy. We think this misses the point. Because we think that when Mexico failed to control their drug criminals and have them enter the United States, they lost the right to have that legitimacy. And that entered the United States' privilege to make sure it could stand and fight. We think that even without this treaty, at the worst case scenario, we're willing to answer hardline and say, Mexico lost the right to have that trial when the United States needed to pay for their crime. We think that by that logic, that analysis falls. But then closing opposition brings up this novel idea, that maybe it's unfair because these people were victims of circumstance. We could agree to disagree, we don't know. But what we're certain of is these individuals feel that it is a valid recourse, that they go to the United States and make their profits off something illegal because we can't find a way to give them fair justice and due process. We think that this is only certain when we go with the government bench. But he thinks that the response to this is that the United States has already been pumping in billions of dollars. Into what sorts of programs? I'm going to name them right now. Border controls with higher walls and more guards. This essentially just drove them into making caves and using the sea. You also started funding cartels and arming Mexican cartels to fight other cartels, those with lesser drugs. That effectively made some drugs coalesce and basically made the war on drugs which we see now, which Niccolo already outlined has a death toll in the hundreds of thousands. This means that all of our processes right now rely on the Mexican system being legitimate and being effective. For as long as that is not true, we need to find a different solution. They never responded to why the deterrent effect that opening government outlined wouldn't work. And they never responded to Niccolo's extension that our system is essentially what removes the perpetuation of this non-cooperation between states that have usually the same goals. But what did we extend in closing? We think that on this system, on it being legitimate, we describe why local governments and local communities will not cooperate because they benefit off the drug trade. How come? Because inasmuch as we see these criminals in the countries of consumption as people who made my brother or my friend addicted, individuals in Mexico see these drug traffickers as people who give them jobs, people who turn in revenues and make roads and give them safety from other cartels. This means that back home, those courts see them as individuals who are indispensable, and people see them as people they should be hiding and giving safety, security, and like other forms of aid to make sure the drug trade continues. What Niccolo argued clearly was that Mexico is not the place to have them judged, because in there, some people think they're heroes. We think that that gets in the way of justice. So it's effectively rebutting the closing extension. How come? Because if their argument is that it's about fairness, and if their argument is that they're being severely treated, that is appropriate, because that was what happened to individuals that they used as markets for their drugs. It's reciprocity, Mr. Speaker, and while it's unfortunate, we think someone needs to pay the price. Before I continue, I'll take one from the opening.
If legitimacy of the Mexican government is vital to stopping the drug war eventually, then how does the harm of a little bit of injustice for consumer countries outweigh the harm of slowly stopping the incipient drug system where drug cartels exist within Mexico?
Because it tells Mexico that it isn't their responsibility to police their border. We think that that's unsustainable. How come? Because up till now, it's been on the United States to secure that border. And we think that's unfair, because that basically insulates the Mexican justice system and tells them that the way they're fighting the war right now, which is just tracking down cartels individually and not freezing bank accounts or doing other things, which are financially, like, maybe unfortunate for the Mexican economy, but necessary to make sure you arrest the drug trade, aren't being considered. We think our policy directly encourages them to take harsher steps. So, further on, why do you think this treaty is the best way out? Nicola already argued, unrebutted, the idea that we need international cooperation because we have the same goals. Because the nature of the drug trade is one that relies on the consuming nation. Mexico wouldn't have a reason to produce, and I flagged this at the POI, so it's not too late for the croissant. Mexico needs the United States to produce, to consume in order for them to have a market for their production. In terms of the Karzai government, the reason why opium, no thank you, is highly produced in Afghanistan is because they have markets overseas in the first world. We think that the moment that you allow these people to be accountable to these justice systems, it's more than just a deterrent effect. It's telling these individuals that you're not supposed to blame the people who get addicted. You're not supposed to blame the people who effectively find their way into these laced drugs. Because at the end of the day, the people who should be held accountable are these individuals who traffic them. They mask this under the assumption of drug muling and under the assumption of people being in unfortunate circumstances. We think that might be true for some employees of these drug traffickers. But if you don't extradite these big bosses into these other areas, we don't think that they would be afraid because they're hidden behind thresholds of capital, they're hidden behind thresholds of bank accounts, no thank you, and we think that decreases the political will for them to cooperate. But what does increase political capital? This was again Nicola's extension. The idea that in exchange for lax extradition laws, you're going to get a laxer border control, where people don't need to fear getting shot in Tijuana, because essentially Mexico's already agreed to extradite, give up part of its sovereignty to make sure that that border is a safer place. Maybe this would mean that visa regulations between Mexico and the US would be a little bit laxer. Maybe this would mean that Afghan citizens don't need to fear going to other countries and be masked as terrorists. We think that there is a distinction between the local government and local people who benefit off narco dollars and the national government that's dealing with collateral effects of the drug trade. We think that our policy effectively gives them a trade-off, where they can enjoy those benefits of laxer border control or laxer immigration policy for more of its citizens in exchange for giving up part of its sovereignty. This is the trade-off I want to leave you with. Sure, you may lose something visceral and visible, the idea that your government can try criminals on their own. But that privilege is reserved only when justice is served. And if you can't prove that we're enjoying that dish, then order something else. Thanks.
Okay, now we call the opposition whip.
At the point at which you have a Gulf case that says you can choose between two dishes, at the point at which you have a Gulf case that says you might be trialed for drug trafficking or you might be trialed for murder if I can find such evidence, you don't really have a Gulf case that's anything more than speculative. And this is important because it comes to an issue that deals with lives, that deals with liberty, and the ability for individuals to make such decisions without the influence of drugs. We understand that drug trafficking is a huge international problem. And insofar as that is the case, very little consideration to how individual parties would act, and merely an assumption that on one hand, they are either extremely corrupt and useless, and the other, they are extremely interested in forms of justice, was the prevailing norm in the side of government. But that isn't the case. Because the first question we need to ask this debate is, really does this stem the harms that drug trafficking brings? The second of which is to ask whether or not it stems the flow of drugs at its core, but let's do it first. Because this motion doesn't necessarily assume, or doesn't paint in black and white, that it will always be the Americans versus the Mexicans in this instance. Yes?
The United States still needs to give justice to victims. Are you going to respond to the principal contention that we share that maybe these people deserve to know?
The answer is yes, and I'll do it a bit more. The first thing you need to understand is insofar as this motion does not set out a specific instance in which this drug trafficker comes from a specific country of production and consumption, and where consumption can happen in either circumstance, their motion works in the reverse instance as well. And it's not always the case when Mexicans are going across the border, it could very well be the opposite. In which case, all the benefits that we work to convert the system that is absolutely useless become, in fact, in the reverse. That is why the more important question to ask is to look at how these harms are being derived. The core point of principal clash of Darrow, especially in what the government likes to say, is that we can derive some kind of justice to these individual victims. The truth is this: in any case that drug trafficking happens, and where consumption of drugs happens, these victims do not get justice. And that is a true blatant consequence. Insofar as the POI, they asked the Prime Minister, is there a place in this world where drug consumption is in fact legal? His answer to it was to dodge the question, to say that, well, that doesn't matter. But the truth is it does, so thank you. Insofar as every time you consume an illegal drug, illegal enough to not be trafficked, you yourself become a criminal. And if that is the case, what then is the justice that you deserve insofar as you took this choice? And I'm going to use the exact same metric that Darryl used. I don't care what kind of circumstance you came from, but if the recourse that you decided to use was to consume a drug, why then is there any point in addressing your kinds of grievances? But the point is this, that in both policies, neither policy creates justice to the victim. Insofar as the victim or the consumer of the drug can't claim anything or can't sue the person who trafficked that drug. So what is the real consequence of what's the real justice that we're looking at in this motion? So this effectively deals with OG so far. Everything we said about better community and stuff like that aren't things that this individual consumer of drugs gets to feel because he's in jail. And more than that, we also think that the true justice is derived is to really answer the question how we can prevent further instances of individuals ever being able to suffer the consequence of drugs. And that will be dealt with in the second question. But to understand this entire debate more interesting, more holistically, we need to understand that the harms of the drug trafficking can also come not just from drugs themselves, but by the laws of individual countries that decide to prosecute individuals via trial. And we think this is important. Insofar as you may not agree to certain circumstances of conceptualization of rights, it is important that you are treated in a fair manner as well. And part of the harm of drugs don't just befall individuals who consume drugs, which we now accept are also criminals, but the criminals who traffic drugs themselves. And we think this is important. Why? And this was never dealt with by Darryl, because he thought dealing with the axiomatic view was enough. It is not the case. Insofar as the individual drug trafficker himself suffers disproportionate harms, it is the harm that also derives of the drug and the circumstance in which it comes from. Insofar as we're able to create circumstances that avoid courts, that very vigilantly try or very exuberantly try to prosecute harsher laws in consequence of drug traffickers, we think we stem the harms of drugs even more. This becomes even more the case in circumstances where you don't arbitrarily put them in jail systems to allow them to interact with other drug traffickers and to interact with other consumers of drugs. That is one of the key criticisms to American jail systems in the first place. Because of such harsh prosecution laws, you put the exact same people in the exact same circumstances in close proximity to further these drug problems. And that's a big problem that's been criticized about American systems to begin with, that you put the exact same systems of people with close proximity to further these drug problems in the future. Never mind that you reduce these individuals back to the circumstances that require them to take the drugs and drug trafficking to start with. No thanks. But let's move to the second question, to which we think, in the reverse, the government has been very much on the back foot. Does the standard flow of drugs? This is at least one half of the problem. But we need to consider whether demand and supply, or the supply of drugs contributes in a primary fashion towards drug trafficking problems. So thank you. The ambit coming up from government is this. Then in all circumstances, the best case scenario for all, well, demand and supply are equal contributing factors. But the worst case scenario that they never really try to deal with is the fact that the only way in which you're able to solve this international problem of drugs is if you stand the flow. And the question, therefore, is how do we do this? It is important to understand that the only and best effect that their policy derives is deterrence on the side of the consuming country. But we don't think this is the best way to address this problem. Insofar as demand and supply are always two sides of the equation, we think that supply is something that we need to target, because demand is always going to exist. The problem to this is the supply increases the instances in which this demand can derive circumstances in which harm can befall on society. That is why it is moot for Darryl to say that this entire debate comes down to a consequence of choice or palette in terms of which dish you want to consider. No, that the thing that they never were able to figure out is the very real tangible, the very real tangible effects from the partner, very tangible effects of how these things have, of how policy that enables individual and localized prosecution systems to attack via the means of plea bargaining, via the means of prosecuting and possessing the production units of drugs in the countries of origin themselves. Their system immediately denies this. And the entire rebuttal that they have is that the only circumstance that these countries are incredibly messed up and they wouldn't prosecute these things in the first place. Problem to this is the solution to remove every single strand of responsibility and capability from these local governments involved. Darryl says that they lose the ability to prosecute the moment the US pays for it. But I think the US is not beyond the point of realizing is if we don't bring this jurisdiction back, the US will have to continue paying for these particular problems in the long run. And in the semblance of the greater picture of justice, it makes more sense to invigorate local courts with the ability of evidence and the ability to prosecute and possess these particular. But the worst problem is that insofar as you continue to tell local jurisdictions and local communities that this is a foreign problem, that this is the individual choice of drug use who decide to take on that risk, those solutions will never come to the hearts of individuals who can potentially make that change. That is one of the things.
Hello?
I feel like this is a debate about revenge, a dish best served cold.
Okay, thank you all. Please make sure you take all your stuff.
All right.
You can leave it here, but you just want to get it to extend.
So lunch.